Welcome to Attire, our Humans Interdisciplinary Seminar Series. So this is our last seminar for the term and for the semester. So we're very excited to have Sarah here with us, and really looking forward to the discussion that will follow. So just a bit of information about what Attire is. So a crucial aspect of Humans' mandate is to create an enticing and vibrant space for critical conversations and encounters. And so Humans Attire Interdisciplinary Seminar Series is really a space for ideas and for connection, but also a physical and virtual space. So we do have a virtual guest here with us today that encourages a different kind of intellectual engagement with the intention of fomenting a different vision of the university. So the seminar series really aims to provide a consistent place for engagement, exchange, and interaction for the human community and across the faculty as well. So just a bit of information on the format of Attire. Attire happens weekly on Thursdays and is open to anyone who's interested. So please look out for our exciting panel of speakers for next semester. And each Attire session really engages with a particular selected paper, academic paper. And so the presenter will introduce her authored paper and also ground this kind of subsequent discussion with the participants. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today. Sarah Sadler is an assistant professor in the Department of Fine and Performing Arts at Liberty College, City University of New York, where she writes and teaches on performance, labor, and cultural economies. Her first book, Performing Corporate Bodies, published by Routledge in 2024, offers the first ethnographic study of theater-based corporate training in India and its global implications. She's currently at work on her second monograph, Performance and the Global Afterlives of Work, a transnational study of how labor is performed, remembered, and reimagined from the gold mines of South Africa to the deindustrialized landscapes of the United States. Her writing can be found in outlets including Performance Research, the Journal of Applied Theatre and Performance, and TDR, the Drama Review. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It seems like a busy time, and I appreciate you thinking with me today. So to begin today, I want to take you to two different performance spaces. So these moments, separated by more than 3 decades, illuminate what I'm thinking of as a broader shift in the role of theatrical performance within South African labor culture. So moment 1 is from Durban in 1988. Quote, "The performance venue is a huge factory floor. Half of it is subdivided into offices. The other half is a large empty space. There is no ceiling and the neon lights are stuck onto the rafters of the tin roof. At night, it is drafty and cold, and during the day, it's stuffy and hot. From outside come sounds of trains and traffic. A few hundred hired people, mostly men, are slumped on chairs. The meeting wakes them up. There are salutes and shouts and then more songs. Some people rise and stamp out the rhythm with their feet. The chairman has announced that Durban Harbor's cultural local will now present a play, and the play is announced briefly. Written as part of one of the only book-length studies of the Natal workers' theater movement, Astrid van Kotze immerses her reader in the world of workers' theater, a form of grassroots performance created by and for working class people, particularly Black workers, during the late apartheid era. Van Kotze's writing captured workers' theater as insurgent political pedagogy. It equipped participants with the language, structures, and tools to confront and alter the circumstances of their exploitation, even from within the confines of apartheid's industrial regime. So moment 2 is from Cape Town in 2021. Quote, "What goes into the potjiekos? Definitely meat, some celery and potatoes, perhaps a little cucumber, some beetroot, maybe some bananas. It's very nice, you must try it. But there's only one problem. None of these ingredients would taste as good if you ate them individually. We all come from different backgrounds, cultures, and religions, and speak different languages. But when we are here, we become part of a global community of over 99,000 people. So we all need to make it our common purpose to include others so that nobody feels excluded." It is around 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm crouched behind a promotional display in the production warehouse of a British biopharmaceutical company, listening to this workplace drama unfold on the stage. This is the 7th performance of a day that began nearly 20 hours earlier. You'd never guess that from the audience, however, a group of mostly women night shift workers who are wide awake, giggling, cheering, and chattering in response to the unfolding story of Zoleka Mahatoto, the protagonist of this DEI-themed industrial theater performance. So in the decades between these two moments, South Africa has undergone seismic political and economic transformation as apartheid gave way to democracy and the ANC shifted from a liberation movement rooted in democratic socialist ideals to a ruling party navigating the imperatives of neoliberal restructuring. The terrain of labor and its cultural manifestations also transformed alongside it. The radical impulses of workers' theater were absorbed into new institutional and ideological frameworks, evolving into a range of creative practices today that continue to grapple with the meanings of labor, identity, and value in the post-apartheid nation. So drawing from a larger book in progress, this presentation today is going to consider the stakes of understanding theater as a form of cultural activism shaped by the shifting logics of capitalism. It explores how the legacies of workers' theater resonate within contemporary industrial contexts, spaces where performance is mobilized often to manage labor, suppress dissent, and stage inclusion. So I'm going to begin with an overview of workers' theater, then trace how evolving democratic and neoliberal state formations post-94 produced new roles for theatrical performance, particularly within industrial theater, a form that draws from yet sanitizes the politics of its predecessors. And then returning to the case study in 2021, I'll discuss how contemporary arts practices like industrial theater often inhabit deeply ambivalent positions, embedded within the bureaucracies, funding logics, and discursive regimes of global institutions, yet not perhaps fully defined by them. Their work is shaped by institutional scripts, but also generates moments of friction, where irony, embodied tensions, and aesthetic choices generate possibilities for creative reimagining. Ultimately, I ask also how the South African case might illuminate broader global dynamics, where post-industrial economies increasingly mobilize performance. I'm thinking through performance really broadly, right? Not just theater, but cultural expression, role play, things like that, immersion. Mobilize performance to repackage labor histories, manage social difference, and ultimately also sustain new forms of economic extraction and control. So this, as I was saying at the beginning, is very much a sort of developing project. So suggestions for ethnography, practitioners, archives would be very much appreciated at the end of the talk. So during the 1970s and 80s, South Africa experienced a period of significant economic growth, particularly in labor-intensive sectors. By 1982, more than 1 million Black South Africans were employed in manufacturing, fueling the concentration of working class and migrant communities in townships. This expansion unfolded alongside deepening political repression and growing global condemnation of apartheid. So, which culminated in sanctions, divestment campaigns, and, of course, a sharp decline in foreign investment. These pressures heightened the volatility of industrial labor as companies tightened their control over increasingly precarious workplaces. Amid these conditions, a new wave of Black labor militancy also began to take shape, catalyzed by events like the Durban strikes of 1973, in which over 60,000 workers participated in walkouts that reignited Black trade unionism after decades of suppression. Events like these marked a turning point, laying the foundation for a powerful and militant democratic trade union movement. KwaZulu-Natal, then known as Natal, also became a critical hub of political and cultural resistance, owing to its dense industrial base and its politically conscious migrant labor force that sustained it. It was largely in this context that workers' theater emerged in centers like Durban and Johannesburg, where labor activism intersected with the formation of independent trade unions, such as the Federation of South African Trade Unions, FASATU, established in 1979 with a strong emphasis on worker control, grassroots democracy, and political education. In its 6 years of operation, Fossatu organized over 120,000 workers across 11 affiliated unions, becoming the largest non-racial independent trade union federation of its time. In 1985, many of these unions also united under the banner of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, which aligned more explicitly with the ANC-led liberation movement and also played a central role in the broader anti-apartheid struggle. The shift from Fossatu to COSATU also marked a strategic transformation from an autonomous worker-led orientation to one more integrated with national liberation politics. So in this evolving political landscape, it was theater and workers' theater that was integrated into the South African labor struggle as a huge part of this burgeoning democratic trade union movement. So globally, traditions like the British workers' theater movements of the 1920s and 30s and the Russian agitprop theaters of the early Soviet era, had demonstrated the power of agitational performance to mobilize working class consciousness. In both cases, the rise of communist ideology played a crucial role in shaping the aesthetic and political aims of these movements. South African workers' theater, while shaped by its own unique conditions of racialized capitalism and state violence, also drew on and resonated with these global lineages. It also forged a distinct mode of cultural resistance, one rooted in collective creation, multilingual improvisational performance, and the urgent need to navigate both industrial exploitation and apartheid repression simultaneously. So I'll just speak through one example of early workers' theater during this period to give you a sense of what the shows were like. So in 1979, members of the Food and Canning Workers Union called on the public to support protesting workers who had been fired from the Faddis and Monis food factory outside Johannesburg. In response, members of the politically engaged Junction Avenue Theater devised a workshop production. So workshop theater was a popular participatory form of theater that merges the lived experiences of participants with broader social critique. And the resulting play was called Security, and it followed the story of an unemployed Black worker who takes a job as factory security guard, or what the show called a watchdog. Under the command of his boss, named Mr. Fatman, the character slowly transforms from a man into a dog, crawling on all fours, barking, and losing his ability to speak. The play staged a haunting allegory of worker dehumanization, revealing how apartheid-era industrial labor erodes not only agency and identity, but the very capacity for speech itself. So over the following decade, workers' theater continued to serve as a vehicle for analyzing union politics, factory hierarchies. It had a big emphasis on also the family structure between workers and their home lives, and the lived contradictions of exploitation. The performances often blended satire with social commentary. Comedy was also very big here, highlighting the mechanization and disciplining of bodies under apartheid industry. As Ari Sitas, who's a theater scholar, but also did a lot of work, ethnographic work into theater movements. As he notes, workers' theater operated in contrast to many of the dominant theatrical forms at the time, particularly the urban Black consciousness-aligned plays popular in Johannesburg's formal arts venues. While those plays often offered a visionary, affective poetics, workers' theater was rooted in what Sitas refers to as the, quote, grotesque humor and hard realism of the underclasses, end quote. In this way, the genre, he argues, bore stronger aesthetic affinities with township theater, a populist style that incorporates physical acting, multilingual performance, music, and colloquial speech to address working class audiences in working class and public spaces directly. Importantly, although I don't really talk about it in this presentation, workers' theater was also one facet of a much broader cultural and creative ecosystem in factories, union halls, and community spaces throughout the 70s and 80s. So this ecosystem included workers' choirs, jazz ensembles, there's protest posters, a satirical workers' clown named Mickey, and the praise poetry of figures like Albert Kabbalah, factory worker and unionist who reach Zulu traditions to critique conditions of working class life. So these cultural forms were political tools. They were ways of educating workers, building fractured yet more collective modes of solidarity, and articulating collective demands through embodied languages. By merging cultural expression with organizing strategies, workers and artists alike used performance to not only resist the psychic violence of racialized capitalism, but also to imagine social and political horizons grounded in justice, dignity, and more collective action. So despite its role in the anti-apartheid struggle, workers' theater has largely faded from the South African contemporary landscape. And I'll just add that depending on who you speak to, for instance, Van Kootsen, who wrote the book on Atoll Workers' Theater, has her own reasons for why it might have faded. And that's something that I still think is quite interesting to think through, but you get a different answer depending on who you talk to. But with the formal ushering in of democracy in 1994, a new era of freedom coincided with and was increasingly constrained by deep structural shifts in the country's economic orientation. So one of the defining features of the post-apartheid transformation has been the attempt to reconcile the ideas of racial justice and redistributive equity with the imperatives of global economic restructuring. Following 94, the ANC government implemented a series of macroeconomic reforms designed to stabilize the economy and attract foreign investment, including structural adjustment, trade liberalization, fiscal austerity, and the privatization of state-owned enterprises. Though presented as necessary steps towards growth, employment, and development, these reforms have been critiqued also for ultimately hollowing out public capacity, weakening trade unions, and accelerating the informalization of labor, especially among the Black majority, who remain structurally marginalized in the economy. So to manage the contradictions of a liberation movement now governed through neoliberal orthodoxy, the ANC pursued state-led policies such as the Black Economic Employment Act, BEE, which aimed to rectify apartheid-era exclusions by mandating racial transformations in corporate ownership. While it created new opportunities for upward mobility, BEE largely operates through market-driven mechanisms, requiring companies to demonstrate compliance through quantifiable performance indicators. In this way, inclusion is reframed not only as a matter of structural redress, but of individual achievement, corporate performance, and entrepreneurial success. The deeper systemic inequalities that have defined the post-apartheid economy were not dismantled so much as recoded through languages of empowerment and meritocracy. And I think I say all this because I think it's broader context that we can understand the emergence of things like, or the cultural recoding of things like workers' theater into something like industrial theater. These collectively devised performances I don't think of as simply suppressed or abandoned, but redirected to serve the cultural and communicative needs of a liberalized post-apartheid economy. So I was supposed to change this now, so here you go. So by the early 2000s, a new form of performance known as industrial theater had emerged as a popular medium in labor-intensive sectors such as mining and manufacturing. And today it's also used in private workplaces and corporate workplaces, leadership promotions, things like that. Typically commissioned by corporate clients, these performances serve as didactic tools to educate workers about workplace safety, public health, HIV prevention, behavioral norms, and others on the shop floor. As a brief example, one industrial theater practitioner I spoke with in 2021, the same year of the case study, she described a large-scale production that she directed every year for a major petrol company. The play, staged annually prior to the COVID pandemic, was performed for over 2,000 petrol attendants per day across multiple sites. It aimed to educate workers on how to prevent pump hijackings and promoted customer service through the slogan, "Service with a Smile." In contrast to the dialogic, participatory ethos of workers' theater, the performance is also scripted and unidirectional, a top-down intervention intended to shape worker behavior through the theatrical form. So while this example reflects a conventional mode of industrial theater, I also want to transition to a concluding case study that returns to 2021 that also, I think, complicates this frame a little bit and reveals how such contemporary cultural forms often remain unstable, bearing traces of earlier theater aesthetics, even when embedded in and constrained by corporate DEI. So in 2021, I participated in an industrial theater performance project commissioned by a global biopharmaceutical company on the outskirts of Cape Town. The production was staged by Stage Fright Entertainment, a Johannesburg-based company founded in 2005 by Tiro Fetcher, who's the gentleman in the center of this photo. It specializes in theatrical interventions for corporate and government clients across South Africa. As a condition of my ability to conduct ethnographic research, Tiro required that I join the cast in the performance. And you might recognize some of them. They were all recent graduates from UCT Center for Performance, Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. Much more talented than I was. It was a humbling experience acting alongside them. So we had one day of rehearsal before performing a demo for the company's management team, who requested small revisions to the script that Tiro had created to better reflect workplace realities. These included incorporating the names of specific company policies into the script, the names of specific managers, and even the ingredients to one of their flagship products. After 4 more days of rehearsal, we returned to the site to deliver 7 performances across a 24-hour cycle for employees who worked different shifts throughout the day. Accessing the work site involves a detailed security clearance process, including extensive paperwork, viewing a safety video, and passing a brief exam on health and safety protocols. The first skit of the day was staged for an audience of mostly white, middle, and senior level supervisors. Later performances were viewed by predominantly Black and colored employees from various departments and occupational tiers in the company. So the performance offered a very fast-paced comedic exploration of the complex dynamics of identity in the workplace. At the center of the skit is a receptionist named Zoleka Mahatoto, who opens the skit by addressing the audience directly, describing herself as, quote, the locksmith, telephone directory, one-person call center, and one-man show. Well, woman, she said. She's soon joined by a charismatic young man named John, who announces that he is about to lead her through the company's, quote, site improvement plan, end quote. This journey will focus on key issues, including discrimination, disability, race, recruitment, and employment equity, as well as tolerance in relation to religion, culture, and tradition. Quote, you see, Zoleka, John says, the world of business has changed, so we need to respond to this changing world. How we work must also change if we want to stay relevant, if we want to do more for our colleagues so that we can feel better at workplace, end quote. Zoleka then turns back to the audience, breaking the fourth wall to interact directly with spectators. She compliments some on their hairstyles and their outfits, and she also playfully mocks others who appear snobbish or self-important in the space. In one performance, she drew especially loud laughter by gesturing towards the white supervisor seated in the front row. Quote, now here is someone I don't like. You know, these guys with glasses, they think they're better than all of us. I'm sure he has a PhD, 2 degrees, a diploma, and a certificate. Unless you're in research and development and you've got CVS, computer vision syndrome. Later on, a trio of characters are introduced as the quote, oh shame, I'm suck flakes, a group that represents workers who routinely complain about their conditions, but also feel powerless to affect material change in the workplace. And one of the play's central comedic devices is its trio's exaggerated reference to their superiors and their bosses as managers, a style stylized and vaguely ethnicized pronunciation that, according to Tiro, signals a non-white perspective. This recurring phrase also draws, according to Tiro, from the tradition of township theater, where the use of Black vernaculars and repeated refrains reinforced central themes. In this context, the term managers underscored the perceived disconnect between white management and the company's mostly Black workforce. So a series of tightly choreographed vignettes follows the trio of ladies as they navigate various workplace challenges. This includes the absence of infrastructure for workers with disabilities, having to wait in long lines to ask for a day off from HR, and a scenario in which one worker is unable to attend her monthly English language training due to the fictional holiday NAM, National Afrikaans Month. As the sketches progress, the characters grow increasingly agitated. They express pride in their jobs while simultaneously lamenting how certain departments and positions in the company remain structured, quote, in terms of demographics. They also condemn what they call the broader culture of moral decay that pervades the workplace. In the final moments of the skit, the cast takes a collective vow, chanting a company slogan while making an impassioned plea for greater visibility and inclusivity among cults. So the performance delivered a racially charged yet ostensibly apolitical portrayal of post-apartheid workplace dynamics. Its critique of white managerialism, which I should also add just in the broader project, I am tracing the differences between what's being critiqued in like industrial theater practices here in the Western Cape, as opposed to something like in Durban and Johannesburg, where the sort of terrain of managerial politics plays out in a different way, and the skits are different, right? But I'll just return to this. Its critique of white managerialism was evident from the outset, beginning when Zuleika proudly announced her surname, whose recognizably Black African roots elicited constant cheers, laughter, and audible remarks from every audience, signaling the skit's broader emotional resonance. The performance also dramatized systemic challenges faced by employees, limited access to professional development, subtle exclusions from office culture, and language hierarchies that define their interactions with management. These depictions struck a chord with audiences who responded with laughter, murmurs, side conversations, clapping, head shakes, and visible gestures of agreement or condemnation. As one cast member reflected during the break, I think the true power of this performance is its struggle over identity. In my conversations with director Tiro Venter, he echoed this view, explaining that his aim in a lot of the industrial theater performances he creates is to expose the ongoing structural oppression confronting those marginalized in the corporate landscape. An aim rooted, he told me, in his own lived experiences as a Black South African. Although anchored in the racial legacies of apartheid, the skit also reframed difference through the language of corporate inclusion, positioning cultural diversity as a strategic asset for cultivating a seemingly open workplace environment. For instance, the audience's reaction to Zuleika's surname was not only a response to its ethnic resonance, but also the surprise and the laughter was based on the performer delivering it. Colored performer speaking in a distinctly Afrikaans accent. Such cross-racial casting is central to Venter's directorial strategy, which involves assigning roles that diverge from performers' own racial or ethnic identities. While Venter frames this as a gesture that promotes a universalizing human experience, the approach, which I also suspect emerges from perhaps his own awareness of if he were to not do that, it might be seen as a bit too real by HR managers. It might be seen as going against the language of sort of multiculturalism here. The approach also mirrors the logics of corporate diversity programming, where the enactment of inclusion is often rendered palatable through a technocratic, depoliticized framing of multiculturalism. This approach also dovetails into a post-apartheid reworking of non-racialism, which tends to prioritize harmony and surface-level representation over structural redress. This differs from the vision advanced by the anti-apartheid labor movement, where non-racialism functioned as a solidaristic, class-based rejection of racial habits. In contrast, present-day business and state institutions often promote colorblind ideologies that depoliticize race and obscure enduring inequalities. The performance then treads a careful line. It surfaces ongoing disparities rooted in apartheid's legacy, without explicitly critiquing contemporary power structures or addressing the state's failures to dismantle them. By relying on cross-racial casting and a politically sanitized vision of workplace harmony, the skit navigates the very fraught terrain of identity in South Africa through the idiom of corporate diversity training. In other words, while performance traditions like workers' theater historically depicted the marginalization of non-white communities, contemporary workplace adaptations often offer a sterilized and hyperbolic fantasy of office life that generates fleeting moments of comedic release and cultural validation, but rarely offer pathways to challenge or transform the systemic conditions that they also portray. Nevertheless, the skit also elicited a range of responses from the audience. Although there are no debriefs following the performance, this is not admitted by HR in most of them. They want the performance, and then conversation afterwards is sort of not part of it. And this is also a departure from workers' theater. Many employees voluntarily approached Bunter and the cast afterwards to share their thoughts. One woman with tears in her eyes grasped Zuleika's hands and expressed how much the skit meant to her. Another expressed her gratitude for the skit's attention to people living with disabilities, but also pointed us to a deeper issue, bullying by white managers. She described how her manager regularly refuses to accommodate her shift preferences and remains indifferent to the risks of her having to take late-night taxis. Yet another employee approached us after the show as we were packing up the van to leave. She praised the performance and then confessed her hate for the company. Referencing a scene in which one of the "oh shame, I'm suffering" ladies waits in a long line, she recounted her own experience in the cafeteria, where white managers often skipped the queue, forcing workers with limited lunch breaks to eat their food cold. The fat are getting fatter, she said, and the thin are getting thinner. Her observation recalls a scene from the 1979 Workers' Security, in which a worker is dehumanized under the surveillance of a factory boss known as Mr. Batman. While the skit bore little semblance to the militant workers' theaters of earlier decades, its responses from audiences, sparked perhaps by its veiled allusions to structural injustices, underscore how enduring histories of subjugation echo and threat throughout the workplace. The performance may not have triggered institutional change, but perhaps it created moments, however banal, where workers could also narrate their own experiences of disempowerment. As such, the skit presents a hybrid and contingent cultural form, oscillating between the utopian promises of the Rainbow Nation and a quietly subversive social commentary that unfolds within, although perhaps not entirely of, the institutions it stages. It is in these slippages, between mandate and reception, or spectacle and sincerity, that the deeper contradictions of labor through the theatrical form are revealed here. The practices discussed in this presentation are part of what I'm thinking of as a broader workers' performance economy in contemporary South Africa, where the tools and aesthetics of performance are retooled to mediate the historical legacies and lived experiences of labor. This inquiry extends well beyond industrial theater, touching a wider constellation of institutional forms, from industrial heritage attractions like Gold Reef City that curate worker mining histories for public display, to urban immersion experiences for leaders, to state-sponsored campaigns that mobilize theater strategies to stage civic virtue, and so on. Across all of these sites, performance becomes more than a mode of representing labor. It becomes a mechanism for shaping how work is remembered, felt, and also embodied in the present. South Africa in this moment, I think, stands at a crossroads where the unfinished promises of liberation are also colliding with the logics of the shifting market. Theater, once a tool of insurgent imagination, has become one of the stages on which this collusion is being staged. What emerges is a paradigm of performance shaped by the afterlives of apartheid, yet increasingly harnessed by global regimes of corporate management, nation branding, and cultural tourism. Here, South Africa, I think, is not an exception, but a magnifier, a distilled site through which these global tensions become visible. So when equity is treated rather as an aesthetic rather than structural, what is really being transformed here? And when performance manages perception, what gets lost? So these are the questions that animate this emerging project, and that I think point towards the growing centrality of performance in the governance of working class or working life today. Thank you. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, it was good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation and lots of thought-provoking stories and examples throughout. I think I'll open first to the crowd. I have some questions, but I think we'll take maybe 2 or 3 each time and then give Sarah some time to respond to the questions if you wish.
Thank you so much. That was so excellent. I really enjoyed that. I've got a kind of basic empirical question. Just whether theatre was commissioned by corporations during apartheid the same way, as you kind of shift from this like organic, critical theatre that's now being appropriated and funded by corporates.
Yeah.
Was that the same? Was that happening back then as well, or is it?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure I can answer it. I think the project is very much still, there might be archival sort of discoveries. I'm inclined to say no, not the same way, right? Because when you saw things like workers' theater, it wasn't commissioned by the corporation, right? You didn't have that sort of like HR or L&D mandated sort of opposite or antithesis to it happening at the same time. I haven't found anything. That being said, more largely, I think in South Africa, as well as even in places like Britain and Russia, you do see, for instance, the use of role play in a what's it called, annual sales meeting, right? You see promotional spectacles by companies that might bring in theater actors. So those sort of disparate, I think, examples of performance being used in other ways, I speculate that they might have been happening, but in terms of like a full-scale counter practice of corporate theater happening during apartheid, I have not. That being said, I'm not. That's certainly a question to look into. So answer it with hesitation. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Amy Hoffman. Actually, I find it's interesting that you asked this question because I was about to ask the same. So, in trying to build the doors, I think what I found really interesting, and you sort of hinted at this, but towards the end of your presentation, essentially, the broader shifts in the sort of landscape of cultural production, and I think I started to really think about is the extent to which radical workers theatre in the 80s emerges as an sort of like an embedded organic culture of production that is deep model, right? And so here's the part by the reorganization economy opened up spaces for commercial production, right? So I would have loved to hear a little bit more about your Ventus companies as an example of this shift in how cultural production, right, including what, in a traditions versus tradition itself is transformed, and that in turn obviously, also radically shifts the way in which theatre enters the industrial workplace. And I mean, it doesn't seem particularly surprising that a play that is scripted and performed by I don't know if they're professional actors, but nonetheless, by actors who are not members of the workforce, will land very differently. So even not regarding the content itself, than a performance that is put on and produced by the workforce. How that might shape collective solidarities in a different way than if you find your individual experiences reflected, perhaps, but not you don't part of
Definitely, yeah. Tiro's company, and I think one of the things that I think I'm also really interested is looking at how theater practitioners, arts practitioners, and theater companies are both they're working both within, but also strategically navigating these broader institutions for prerogatives. Like speaking with Tiro is fascinating, right? And I also worked with him on a COVID awareness roadshow 2 years ago that we went all around Cape Town. And so his work also does like educational applied theater too. And I wrote an article in a journal that gets a lot more into this, like how he talks a lot about, for instance, he was funded through the PESP, Presidential Employment Stimulus. Yeah, so he talked a lot about that and sort of how he navigated this sort of like funding imperatives of that, or the lack of like things people went through with it. And also his own tactics in terms of, for example, one of the things that he does is for this show in 2021, he brought in all these UCT grads. For another one, he always brings in young performers that don't have a lot of experience. So, and that's when you speak to him about his methodology, he's very adamant to sort of say, this is part of my own politics, and this is how I'm sort of bringing it in. But yeah, I think that I want more broadly the project to also attend to that. Oh, something else here, when you were talking about how the perception of the shows lands differently depending on whether it's workers versus hired performers. I just wanted to add 2 comments. One of the things that's been to note about workers theater is there's very little archives. Like Astrid's book, because she was there, is like a gold mine, but she'll even talk about the ways that, for instance, like security, I'm not sure if it was security or a different one, the first time that it was actually like performed, the whole thing was in front of workers, right? Because all of the workers spoke different languages, they were all coming in and out of their shifts in the workplace. So in terms of any sort of body of archive work on workers theater specifically in scripts, it's just very limited. So in terms of thinking through the archive and how to pay attention to those differences, I think that's a bit of a struggle. Something I think we wanted to add to your comment. Oh, and one other thing I just wanted to add is that nevertheless, you do see companies today, like next week, I'm going to be joining a company called the Adjustment Bureau in Joburg, and they're doing an industrial theater skit with the mining community outside Joburg. One of the things that they do is ask the workers to come up on stage and create so like a Augusto Boali and Forum Theater type thing. They do ask the workers to come on stage. That being said, I still think that's a complete thing. Right, but nevertheless, we're seeing this. It's very contingent, right? It's very, yeah. But thank you for your comments. I don't know if that answered any of them, but just, yeah.
I'm interested in how you came to the sensory research project, because it's sort of like, I think for me, workers theatre, industrial theatre, there are 2 different kinds of practices.
Yeah.
So the common thing is that they do like labor and workers are involved.
Yeah.
They're 2 different things.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in how you came to the project and in the site, because I think also as part of theatre, it's not really, like I think in terms of theatre, it's seen as like an art, especially in natural theatre, it's not really looked at or interrogated that much.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there is a strong connection in between workers theatre and applied theatre rather than workers theatre and industrial theatre. Because I think we do critique that industrial theatre is sort of like apolitical, like really safe and solid things. So I think maybe they're, in terms of politics, like different connections.
Yeah.
Well, so how did you come to this project?
Yeah, so sure. I'm going to use my moderator hat. So I have a question that jumps on to Linda's stuff. And I guess that was also something that I picked up on, that it's writing of a particular history that uses, I think, time and kind of these big kind of political movements. But I was wondering, like, whether or not, I guess, everyday people whether or not it lines up so nicely, like, you know, the kind of like the collapse of workers' theatre and then the rise of industrial theatre as being tied to independence and kind of this increase in this South African inclusive neoliberalism, right? And I was curious about in the absence of perhaps the opportunity to interact with the people viewing the show, and kind of like those the post-show processing about kind of the lives of people who have performed in like workers' theatre. Like, did any of them end up transitioning from workers' theatre to industrial theatre? Like, did any of them kind of, I think there was like, did anyone move from like township theatre to like, what are the overlaps, I guess, in terms of the people between workers' theatre, township theatre, I think the Black consciousness movement inspired plays, and kind of the industrial and corporate theatre today, right? Because it seems like it might be a smaller space. And so looking at the agentic ways that actors and performers negotiate these different power dynamics might shed some light on whether or not it's such a smooth transition.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, to a certain extent, I don't have really good answers for you because the project is still being fleshed out. So in my first book, I looked at theater-based corporate training in India. And so I spent a really long time. I started out working with this is sort of getting to your, Linda, your question about how I got involved in the project. I started going to India around 2010 as an intern with a company that did theater for social change, and it was a lot of activist work. And you know, I was like in my first year of grad school, hanging out, you know, not thinking about this is a research project at all. But one of the things that I found really fascinating was that all the activists were doing corporate training jobs to sort of make the money to do their activist work. And so when I started talking to them about their passions, their sort of politics, and how the work they're doing, one of the things that they would constantly cite is India's longstanding history of like activist theater, not just like street theater. So I promise I have a point, but in the first book, part of what that book tried to do, I don't know how well it landed, but it tried to sort of trace through the oral histories of these corporate theater practitioners this history of and similarly to South Africa, there was a huge sort of moment of liberalization and activist theater turning into corporate theater. So in some sense, I think I'm falling into the trap of maybe trying to do that in this sort of case, but to come at it in another way, I think your questions about how did I get involved in this and where did workers' theater come from is similarly when I started talking to people who did industrial theater, they would often encourage me to look at workers' theater. They would often say, like, you know, for the theater in the workplace in South Africa, it's been used to it for a really long time, and we'd encourage you to look at this history. That being said, a lot of the people that do industrial theater are applied theater practitioners, right? So like the industrial theater is one component of, even for instance, Tira's COVID awareness roadshow. It was an applied theater work, right? So one of the things I think is really interesting is the sort of multi-pronged nature of practitioners doing this work. Is they'll do a workers' theater performance, but I think not workers' theater performance. They'll do an industrial theater performance, but I think they might think of it as a broader form of applied theater, right? I think maybe one of the things I'm wrestling with this, right? I don't know whether or not to keep the project narrowly focused on workers and industrial, or start to think about these other manifestations of like applied theater and how practitioners. So I think one of the things I'm really sort of grappling with now is where to go next with this project. Like, yeah, that probably did not answer your question at all, but if you have any suggestions, I mean, please do let me know, because I'm sort of at a standstill with it. You know, there's also like, Tiro, for instance, last year, he brought in because I think it's a question of the aesthetics too, right? When you talk to Tiro, in his words, he's like, we're bringing township theater aesthetics systems of workplace. So that also brings up the question of township, right? And when you would talk to Astrid Van Closer, she sort of says the same thing, and other people who are doing this work. So that I think my own confusion, perhaps, but also mentioning of these different arts forms is in being inspired by these conversations I'm having with practitioners who sort of position it as an amalgamation of all of these different arts, right, in some way. But the one thing I'll just also add is that like, I have noticed that in recent years, for instance, Tiro last year brought the same, because there is a certain aesthetic language to every skit that's similar, right? And they're bringing it into a whole host of other things. The city of Cape Town last year hired Tiro to come in and perform, essentially, they didn't call it industrial theater, but it was very similar to his industrial theater work, right? It's 20-minute scripted performance, like comedic, same characterization, things like that, to sort of promote the municipal values of Cape Town. So how to think through all of that, I'm not sure, but maybe it's a matter of thinking about then the aesthetics of it, the choices, the aesthetic choices that are being made. Anyway, again, if you have any suggestions, I'm listening.
I'm curious about that. I'm not in performance studies, so I'm not quite sure how to theorize the use of aesthetics. But I was thinking as you were talking about the chapter that you shared, and particularly for teachings on like theatre for the oppressed, theatre for liberation, and then connecting that with, I guess, the aims or the methodology behind township theatre as really theatre for social change in a particular moment. And I'm curious about whether it's really possible to use a methodology that was crafted as a means of speaking back against power, speaking back against the state. Can you really use that methodology when you're financially reliant on corporations to continue to, I guess, pay you to do this type of work? And how does it change what at its core, what township theatre was meant to do or intended to do? And I guess, like, how would the pioneers of, I guess, workers' theatre and township theatre respond to almost this, I don't want to use the word bastardization, but yeah, this is where it's coming of what they intended for it to be.
Yeah, like one of the things that I feel like I'm struggling with in this project is how to escape the binary of like, this is appropriation or not, or bastardization or not. Because I think what interests me in the project is the ways in which, similarly to what interested me in my last project, is like the ways in which you see arts practitioners doing this work, doing lots of different types of work with lots of different types of institutions, and how they on their own terms, I think, are thinking through that negotiation, right? And I think, and that's why, I was talking to someone else, CUNY, about this project, and I think I'm really having trouble, because I'm really having trouble finding the language to sort of like characterize that, right?
We'll see it in the Tina.
Well, I was just, I'm not in this area, but I'm studying the way, especially in mining companies,
Yeah.
build their hegemony in different territories. Like working with technology and also with all different cultural expressions of the knowledge matrices of different people. And what, and obviously, contemporarily, one of the issues that really makes us worry about is the so-called ESG, right? We already really factor, you're talking about environmental governance controlled by the companies. And you mentioned also wow. And I was here, one of the, we can see that they cannot control certain expressions. And one of them is theater. And the theater that manifests itself in many different ways, as you're saying here. Sometimes even in the way people decide to train workers to deal with children.
Yeah.
And it's surprising for me, for example, seeing in Soweto, where you have an amazing destruction of the health of people and so on, where you have contamination and all other things. But even if they try to convince people with different cultural expressions or financing, especially theater, it's impossible to control because those issues always come up. As they come up in Brazil, for example, because the big summer schools are result and they are big theater, just that goes to the places and no matter the type of control, but there's always the strong manifestation of inequalities of the way you have the different interests manifesting itself in different territories. So I don't know if you're looking at that, and I think that is fascinating.
Yeah.
No matter how, no matter how controlled is the territory.
Yeah.
Those manifestations, when theater doesn't reproduce it simply, I don't know how much.
Yeah, I think you say it so beautifully that the idea of there's something about sort of like immediate and improvisational and embodied just unstableness of the theatrical form that is impossible to control. I agree with you. I think one of the things that is impacting this project is like when I go back to when we were loading up the van and there was the woman on her smoke break, and she was like, I hate it here so much. Like that was a really beautiful skit, but like I hate it here. And I don't know, I mean, there are these interstitial sort of moments of such intense like expression, and then of course then she had her story about how the white managers cut her in line and she can't eat her food and things like that. But then again, like I feel like there's a lot of my work that tries to track those moments. At the same time, I feel like when it manifests in my writing, it sort of becomes a romanticization of these moments of, do you know what I mean? Like, so I'm trying to find language of trying to encapsulate that impossible, because as a theater practitioner, I agree with you. And I think that undergirds my passion in the work, is seeing that in these places. But yeah, I still think there's a lot to grapple with in terms of the writing. And yeah, thank you for that.
There's Tina. I have a lot of few points and questions. Can I go through the whole sheet?
Please, yeah.
Okay. So first of all, what is DEI?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I should know that.
It's okay, in the US, it's totally gone now. So
Is Tiro Fence black or white?
he's black.
And who was the white guy in the photo?
That was John.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
but Tiro always does have the joke of when he first starts talking to a company, his last name sounds white.
I've never heard
And
of black.
Yeah, so he.
I'm very young. And then in terms of, so that security play had William Kentridge's drawings in there.
Yeah.
And I guess a friend of mine has also done some artwork. I guess of the man who turns into a dog, the watchdog.
Okay.
And he was based in Johannesburg.
Okay.
I think he was the first black, what do you call it? art student at Wits. I don't know if he has any insight, but surely William Pentridge would have insights into that play.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the industrial plays, being about encouraging diversity. So I'm a full student, and in TV, I guess, so from around the 2000s, post-apartheid, the SABC's policy was also to encourage diversity through their television programs, which aligns with the government's policy at the time. But then from about 2010 onwards, that kind of changes and the focus becomes more on like ethnicity and identity rather than on diversity. So it's interesting to me that that kind of hasn't changed, or the other plays from 2021, and that's still, I mean, it's still about diversity. That's interesting. I don't know if it means anything.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, you said that you had been talking to some of your colleagues back in the States about, I'm not sure what, but I wrote down that for me, the difference between, what did you call it? Not industrial theatre, workers' theatre, protest theatre, would have been, for me, the difference is volunteerism versus employment. So during apartheid, people weren't being paid to do that. They were doing it because they believed in it. They believed it was a way to bring about change. Whereas today we have to survive. We don't have time to bring about change because of the neoliberal economy that the government adopted. So I don't know if that helps also.
Yeah, these are, I was thinking about that. Sort of like just maybe differentiate out, or just like even thinking through Junction Avenue theaters, their archives is something I want to check out next week, and how much they had involved with that, and the volunteerism versus employment, and how that's sort of really central. Thank you.
I think people who were adults in the 1980s, they tend to complain about how the spirit of volunteerism is absent nowadays. But I mean, yeah, different rules and governments. Sorry, we have one more question over here. But we can.
I was just thinking of some literature that I work with PhD, which maybe you know about ethical capitalism, and like Dina Rajak and Catherine Dolan kind of using theatre metaphors for these kind of inclusion policies. Dina Rajak, DINAHRAJAK, Catherine Dolan. There's like an anthropology of ethical capitalism that combines different methods. So yeah, it's the metaphor of theatre. And kind of way that companies accumulate moral gaps, affecting structural changes through policies and discourse. But I think there's something really interesting here about like a literal stage and how that literal stage is supposed to cement and augment ethical capital for companies in a way by like convincing workers. The literal stage enables genuine, subversive, satirical, this is what you were saying earlier, like the embodied this of like some kind of subversive energy to be smuggled in to what, it's like, I don't know, like using this like metaphorical stage so central to critical accounts of this like changing nature of capitalism, where why processes that used to be resistant to capitalism are now being appropriated into the infrastructure. The literal state of being in place of some kind of, I don't know, this is what you're saying. It's not
Even if it's just standing.
Yeah.
Like feeling resonance, that's still something.
Yeah.
This, like, the other kinds of confusion
Yeah.
and stuff is actually quite potently controlling in the literal state, literal stage. Is
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for the reading. I don't know that as well.
I'll just do one. I think Dulce had a comment, and then we can turn over to Sarah for just some final comments.
It's a very important issue, but I think it will take centuries to discuss that. But anyhow, so you talked about something which is it's for example looking to romanticizing the Jews or things like this.
Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you that this is something that we should discuss a lot more. How liberal thinking and sometimes is incorporating our critical view and above all, making sure that there is no utopia in whatever you do. I feel that very much, and I have to tell you, I have a problem because I'm an architect and engineer, so I'm writing and basically a science, no network science person. So I think that this is so strong in limiting our archiving, limiting our decision on themes and the way we look at what's reviewed on territories. You help me a lot in my dilemmas now. But I think that we always should think about.
Yeah.
It's the same thing of we have to always cite resources, and sometimes resources is your interpretation of multiple realities and even with multiple approaches. Just thank you.
Just hand over to you. Just
Well, I think that's a beautiful
closing.
ending. I think that ending on liberal politics and thinking and how it undergirds a lot of alternatives. I think that was a beautiful ending. Thank you for thinking with me on this emerging project. I really appreciate it. And I will just add a plea of, if you're like, oh wow, Sarah really needed to look at this, please email me, send me anything that might help me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, everyone, for this really engaging seminar. We'll see you next semester.
Thank you.